for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics in July. Can you believe it's July? So excited to have you with us to hear some of our favorite authors talk about some of their favorite topics, a little bit about the research that goes on. Really excited to have you with us. I hope you enjoy listening wherever you like to get your podcasts, or perhaps if you haven't, give us a shot on YouTube. Also want to send a big thank you to my wonderful patrons who make Royals, Rebels, and Romantics possible. Now sit back and enjoy spending your summer with Royals, Rebels, and Romantics.
Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to welcome back to the podcast Nathen Amin, who is here to chat with us about his upcoming, recently released book about one of our favorite characters, Henry VII. And you'll notice I have one of his books behind me. I also have others on the iPad, so I'm well versed. You know, he's one of my favorites. So Nathen, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
No problems. Always thank you very much for having me. You always give me a chance to share my stuff. So here I am.
Well, I'm just so excited about this book. So this book, the title is Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. So we've covered how on the Beaufort side, we got to Henry Tudor, and this is now the Tudor side of the story. So why did you feel like this part of the story needed to be told?
Well, this is the story that I've always wanted to tell. Ever since I've been interested in the subject, we're going back about 14 years. It's always been the Welsh side of the family I've been interested in. I mean, I am born and bred in the same part of the world as Henry Tudor himself. And that's always been a close personal link for me into this subject. I mean, everyone comes to any historical subject with their own connection. There's something that draws them towards historical figures for whatever reason that could be. A lot of cases, that is something in your own personal life that draws you in. For me, it was as simple as I developed an interest in the Tudors, and there was a Welsh Tudor from my backyard. What I very quickly realised was, there was very little written 14 years ago about the Welsh Tudors. There had been one book written in 1985, which was the year I was born. So, you know, that felt like an age ago. And, you know, at the time I wasn't aware, but there were a few historical articles, academic articles out there. But obviously when you're just looking for an easy read, you're not going to have access to them. You know, that is something that is written for an academic audience. So there really was nothing. So I started writing blogs about the Welsh Tudors as I was learning more myself. That did manifest itself eventually into the book you just showed, which was Tudor Wales, my guidebook to Tudor sites in Wales. Again, another very overlooked aspect of the Tudor world. People always relate the Tudors with England. Merry old England, Tudor England. And of course, they were a Welsh family. They were from Wales. So I just feel like it shouldn't be an aspect that has been overlooked. Luckily for me, it seems that over the last 14 years, while I've been delving into the subject, there's many people out there on both sides of the pond who seem to agree. You know, the subject of Henry VIII, his 6 wives, Elizabeth I, it is a very well-trodden ground. There's always more to explore. There's always different voices to explore, but it is a well-trodden ground. Let's go back. Let's see where the Tudors came from. Now, I did get, you know, waylaid by side quests during the last 14 years, the Beaufort's being one of them, Henry VII's reign, and the Pretender's another one. But this is the story I've always wanted to tell, and now I have told it. It's a story nobody knew but the Tudors, and hopefully until now.
Right. And you see where they come from. Now, one of the reviews I read, I really liked this phrase that the Welsh Tudors were a family that, quote, dared to become great. I just thought that was a great phrase. Talk to us a little. Do you agree with that first? and talk to us a little bit about that family and their long and arduous rise to greatness.
Yeah, I suppose that is kind of on, nail on the head, really. This is a family. We call them the Welsh Tudors just for convenience, but Wales, they did exist using patronymics during them days. So every generation would have had a different name. This simply would have been, Tudor ap Gronwy, Tudor the son of Gronwy, and then his son would be Hywel ap Gronwy, and so on. But we use the Welsh Tudors just for convenience. So this family, they survived the conquest of Wales in 1282. Again, not many people outside Wales know this, but England was conquered in 1066 by the Normans. Wales or the Welsh held on until 1282. 200 more years before this piecemeal conquest of the Welsh people was completed by Edward I. And the Welsh royal families were wiped out. Now, the Tudors were a family who we can say were one of the most prominent families of their day in North Wales, but they weren't the kings and princes themselves. They served the kings and princes. But after the conquest, they managed to retain their position of influence amongst the Welsh. Throughout the 14th century, they were influential people. But they did chafe somewhat under English rule. English rule was quite oppressive during these days. English noblemen and English knights were parachuted into Wales to take care of the administrative and official aspects of ruling Wales. Welshmen were pushed to the side. So we do have a few instances where members of this family do rebel. In 1346, for example, we have Hywel and Tudor ap Gronwy, two brothers who kill an English royal official. In the year 1400, we have 5 brothers from this family, or rather 3 brothers still living, who take part in a Welsh war of independence against the English crown. Later on, of course, we have Owen Tudor, another son of this family, who moves to England, where he becomes a rebel. His son, Jasper Tudor, another rebel. And of course, Henry Tudor, yet again, another rebel. The Tudor family are a nest of Welsh rebels. That's what they are. They hold the line for a while, but they always raise their head above the parapet to try and get, something for themselves. And this is replicated throughout the generations. There is something in this family, a pride, a knowledge of where they came from that strives for more. They really are a family on the make. Everything they have, they've taken, including, of course, Henry Tudor.
Well, that's interesting because when the story becomes, I think, a little more well known with Owen coming into the court of Henry V, we see them as blending into the Lancastrian side. But of course, the Lancastrians themselves, starting with Henry Bolingbroke, take the throne. So talk to us a little bit about Owen Tudor and how he comes into the court of Henry V.
So what's really interesting about Owen Tudor is he's something of what we would call today an economic migrant. He is the son of rebels, and Wales is completely destroyed in the first decade of the 15th century by the House of Lancaster. This Welsh Tudor family, they rebel against the House of Lancaster, the English crown, and they go to war. But they are defeated, and the family are destroyed as a as a unit of influence. They lose everything, and there's nothing left in Wales. No power, no influence, no positions, no money, nothing for young Owen Tudor. So he migrates. He goes across the border to try and find work. Now, we don't know when, we don't know how, but he does seem to eventually catch the eye of a certain woman. And this is the widow of Henry V. This is the Dowager Queen of England, Catherine of Valois. There are various stories how they met. We don't know which ones of them are true, but something attracts this young couple together, and Owen marries her in secret. So now he's become a rebel, but in a very different way to that of his forefathers. You know, they became rebels by war. He's become rebels by love, because it is forbidden to marry this widowed queen, the mother of the boy king Henry VI. And we should just stop there just for a moment to realize just how absurd this is, that his father went to war with the House of Lancaster. Just one generation later, Owen Tudor is now a part of the House of Lancaster through this marriage to Catherine of Valois, wife and mother of Lancastrian kings. That's just absurd. But he does end up living in secret with Catherine of Valois. They have 4 children, but then she dies aged 35 in 1437. And this is a problem for Owen Tudor, because suddenly he cannot be protected by his wife. It does seem that the King's Council, who are ruling the kingdom on behalf of the boy king, they are aware of this marriage. And as soon as Catherine of Valois is out of the way, they come for Owen Tudor. He is locked up, he is thrown in prison. He escapes, but he's brought back. It does seem that his life may very well have been in peril if it wasn't for the intervention of, I guess, what we would call his stepson, the king, King Henry VI. This is a king we all know would go on to have quite a sympathetic character, and at this time he is 16 years old, and he becomes aware that the husband of his mother, who is recently deceased, is being pursued. He steps in and he says, no more. Leave Owen Tudor be. And even more so, 2 of his living sons, Jasper and Edmund Tudor, these are my young half-brothers. I am now going to raise them myself. So the Tudor boys, Owen's sons, now become part of the English royal court. And again, it's a remarkable turnaround in just a generation or two, when we consider where the Tudors started the 15th century, which was Welsh rebels fighting the House of Lancaster.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary because here they are, close members of the royal family. Henry VI treats them very well, these 2 half-brothers of his, and the fact that he would stand up to his council and get them to leave Owen Tudor, to let him out and leave him alone, is quite extraordinary for Henry. Henry VI seemed to really have an interest in Owen and in Edmund and Jasper, certainly.
Absolutely. And, you know, he gives them a very good education. And then once we get to the early 1450s, he suddenly brings them into the royal court at the age of 21 and 20, respectively, and he gives them earldoms. He makes Edmund Tudor the Earl of Richmond. He makes Jasper Tudor the Earl of Pembroke. Now, the 1450s is a decade of factional conflict at court, which would eventually manifest itself as the Wars of the Roses. It does seem that Henry VI is trying to create a new power block. So he's bringing through the Tudors, and he's giving them titles, and they are going to be good supporters to him. More so, he actually grants Edmund Tudor the wardship and the marital rights to one of his cousins, Margaret Beaufort. Now, Margaret Beaufort is still a child at this time, but it doesn't stop Edmund Tudor marrying her and impregnating her fairly quickly. You know, he's 26 years old. She is just a child of 12 at this point. It wasn't okay now, and it wasn't okay then. But he does it, and this gives him a claim on her inheritance. But what I do think is happening here, quite wider than this, is at this point at this time in question, Henry VI doesn't yet have a son, and there is questions over the succession. Will it be the Duke of York? Will it be one of the Beauforts? There is issues taking place at court. I think Henry VI was trying to create a potential alternative line of succession. He marries his cousin Margaret Beaufort to his brother Edmund Tudor, and that boy could potentially have a claim to the Lancastrian throne. It's not a good one, but at the end of the day, he would be very close in blood to the Lancastrian king. Now, we never know if that plan was true, because within weeks or months, Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou, does conceive. So the Lancastrian succession is now back where it should be. It's with Henry VI. But of course, 30 years down the line, that union did have far-reaching consequences against all the odds.
Yes. So as time moves on in the reign of Henry VI, the Wars of the Roses begins as York rebels against him for a greater place first in the council, and then eventually decides to claim the crown. What role do the Tudors, Owen and his two sons, play in the Wars of the Roses? Do they stick with the Lancastrians? Are they rebels again? How do they play this one out?
So initially, Jasper Tudor certainly tries to maintain a middle line. So before the very first battle, he's actually quite closely aligned with the Duke of York, Richard of York. He seems to be understanding York's reforms are important to try and save the crown for the House of Lancaster. Jasper seems to understand this, and he does align himself with the Yorkist faction. But of course, once the fighting begins, he's straight on the side of his brother. Once the lines really split between York and Lancaster, and it now becomes about more than just power at court, it becomes about the crown, Jasper is the ultimate loyalist to his brother. Edmund Tudor, he dies only 1 year into the Wars of the Roses, but his position does seem to have been quite clear. He was sent into Wales to guard that country against the House of York, because Wales was something of fertile breeding ground during this period of the Wars of the Roses, because a lot of the major magnates had lands there. People get confused these days with the terms Yorkist and Lancaster. They assume it's about those great cities in the north of England. But a lot of the magnates' power was actually in what we now call South Wales and the English borderlands, Shropshire, Worcestershire, Herefordshire. That, it's very much a southern battle taking place between powerful magnates. So Edmund Tudor was sent into Wales to try and hold that for the House of Lancaster. But very quickly he gets attacked by Yorkist allies of Richard of York, and he dies. History tells us he died of the plague. I think it was a lot more shadier than that. I think Edmund Tudor was bumped off by these Yorkist allies in South Wales. Now that makes sense. Dynastically, get rid of this blood brother of the king, get rid of this dynastic rival in South Wales, but also get rid of this 26-year-old who's just impregnated a 12-year-old. Did that come to play? Either way, the timing of Edmund Tudor's death is very suspicious. It means that when Henry Tudor is born in Pembroke in 1457, he's born 3 months after his father has died. So he never knows his father. His surrogate father becomes his uncle, Jasper Tudor. So I think what we see with the Tudor brothers is they understand everything they have, everything they've been given is because their brother, the king, has given it to them. They have no independent wealth, no independent power, influence, nothing. Everything comes from Henry VI. So they stand devoted to him.
So they have created their own, and then Edmund dies and Jasper sort of takes up that brotherly support for Henry VI. What about Owen? Tell us his story.
So Owen, obviously, early on in the story, he finally escapes prison and death because the king intervenes. And he likewise pledges his support to his stepson, Henry VI. Now, he's not of the blood of Henry VI, of course. So he plays a far quieter role in the background. In fact, we lose sight of him a lot during the 1440s and the 1450s. He's probably just enjoying his early retirement. His sons are taken care of. His wife has sadly died. He's probably just laying low. When the Wars of the Roses begin, he quickly flocks to the side of his son Jasper Tudor. And he is actually at Jasper's side during the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in 1461. Now, this is a devastating day for the Tudor family. Jasper Tudor loses the battle to the 18-year-old opponent who was soon to become Edward IV, the King of York. Jasper loses in battle to Edward, and he flees the country. Owen Tudor is captured. Now, a couple of months before this, Edward's father, Richard, the Duke of York, has been executed. And 18-year-old Edward needs vengeance. The first person of note he gets his hands on is Owen Tudor. So Owen Tudor is a small player, but he is the son of Jasper Tudor, related to the King of Lancaster. Owen Tudor is aged 60 years old at this time, but he's taken to Hereford Marketplace and he has his head chopped off. And this is quite a brutal end for Owen. And he, in fact, remarks when he puts his head on the chopping block that this is the head that once lay on the lap of Queen Catherine. And it's just a remarkable, tragic end to an unbelievable story that Owen has. What an arc he has throughout his life, from rebel child to husband of a king, or a queen even, to death in dynastic blood war. It's remarkable. But he does die. And if only he was able to understand that the 4-year-old grandson that he knew, Henry, would one day wear a crown.
Well, it is extraordinary because it's not quite the same as dying in battle. When you're captured and executed after, it's a very deliberate, revenge-oriented thing for the Tudors, this family. And Owen's arc is, as you say, just fascinating. From a child in Wales to, dying with a grandson who will eventually take the throne because of his relationship with Catherine. Yeah, extraordinary.
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately for Henry, Owen, I think he was just the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Edward, the future Edward IV, just wanted someone's head, and Owen happened to be there for him.
Yeah, and represented support of Lancaster, real support of Lancaster. And Beaufort, which was also an issue. All right, so now you have Jasper, and you've mentioned Jasper as the surrogate father, the caretaker of Henry. So what does Jasper do to protect and care for this young boy who's representing a union between Beaufort and Tudor that is very interesting?
So, I mean, Margaret Beaufort is married off again very shortly after the death of her first husband, Edmund Tudor. She's still only, 14 years old when she has her second marriage to Henry Stafford, the son of the Duke of Buckingham. Now, this is arranged by Jasper Tudor, and it makes sense. Jasper Tudor and the Duke of Buckingham are both hardcore Lancastrians. They are part of the same faction. And they're also neighbours in South Wales. Now, at the end of the day, in this age, Margaret needs a husband. She needs somebody to care for her. It wasn't on Jasper to do that. So Margaret is married off fairly quickly. Jasper, however, retains control of Henry Tudor in his castle at Pembroke. And this remains the case until Henry's 4 years old. Now, this is 1461. This is when Jasper loses this battle, his father is killed, and Jasper is forced to leave Wales behind. And he spends pretty much the next 25 years in exile. But this means that the 4-year-old boy now needs a guardian, and his wardship is sold to the Herbert family. And Henry is forced to move to Raglan Castle in Monmouthshire, and this is where he would be raised for the next 10 years. He had a pretty decent upbringing in Monmouth, in Raglan. He considers, the Herberts a family who look after him well, but he does make mention later on that he considers himself to have been a prisoner at this time. Yes, he wasn't in chains. Yes, he was being brought up honourably, but his fate was not his own as a child. He was being raised by his enemies, effectively. Now, when 1470 rolls around, there's another change on the throne. The House of Lancaster are briefly returned to the throne. And Jasper returns. And now Henry Tudor, at the age of 14 years old, is reunited with his uncle. Now, he would have last seen him when he was a toddler. They would have had to really have got reacquainted fairly quickly. But if there were any issues, that soon was put to the side because the House of York came back with a vengeance. And this time, they conclusively wiped out the Lancastrians. We get to 1471, we get to the Battle of Tewkesbury, and the House of York wipe out their enemy. And this is a problem because all of the Lancastrian-blooded royals are gone. And a light is now shone on young Henry Tudor. 14 years old, small amount of Lancastrian blood in his veins, but enough for it to be a problem. And Jasper Tudor knows this. So he grabs his nephew, he whisks him abroad, and the Tudors spend the next 14 years in exile. So Henry Tudor, to recount, at 4 years old, he was removed from Pembroke Castle. He spent the next 10 years living with his family's enemies, the Herberts, at Raglan Castle, and he would now spend the next 14 years a pawn of the Duke of Brittany abroad. Henry Tudor has no power of his own whatsoever throughout his entire life until the age of 28, when he becomes king himself. Again, just another remarkable insight into a man. When we look later on and we accuse Henry Tudor of having suspicion, of having paranoia, of being a cautious man, look at his life up to the point he becomes king. It makes great sense that he's suffering with something we would possibly call PTSD today, in how it shaped his outlook on life, how it made him be wary of people.
Well, yeah. So what was his life like for those 14 years in really political exile, like an enemy of the state?
He was kind of trapped because he seeks refuge with the Duke of Brittany. Brittany then was an independent duchy, but it had a problem. The French wanted to invade and conquer Brittany. The reason they couldn't do that was the Bretons had an alliance with England. Now, England wanted the Tudors back. The French wanted the Tudors because they were related to them. So the Duke of Brittany instead does this middle path. He tells the English he won't give them to the French. He tells the French he won't give them to the English. And he sits tight. But it does mean that Henry Tudor is kind of languishing for 14 years in this world where he doesn't know what the upshot is going to be. Now, there are a few occasions where the Bretons are nearly swayed by English gold. And in fact, there is one occasion when Henry's only 19 years old and he is handed over to the English. He is taken as far as the Breton port of St. Malo and he's about to be put on a ship. If he gets on that ship, we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about Henry VII. We wouldn't be talking about the Tudors full stop. They would have been just a footnote in history because Henry would have been taken back to England and he would have been quietly killed. At the last minute, he fakes an illness. And in the confusion that follows, he manages to escape. And he runs into the nearby church and he claims sanctuary. The Englishmen try to break in and the Bretons say no. You might break sanctuary in England, you do not break it in Brittany. And the English return empty-handed. And just on a small, flip of a coin like that, are we sitting here today talking about the Tudors? Henry escapes. So he is living this paranoid life. when is he going to get handed over? When is he going to get killed? Now, the great thing for Henry is that this does change for him, as we all famously know. And this changes because in 1483, Edward IV dies and Richard III becomes king. Now, whatever happened with the Princes of the Tower, the fact is there were some people in England who didn't trust Richard III, and they would rather see anybody on the throne whatsoever, whoever it is, who wasn't Richard III. They wanted anyone. And eventually their gaze came to rest on this random Welshman living across the sea in Brittany. He would do. He was somebody, we'll accept him. And that's what happens. Henry Tudor gets reinvented as a potential king of England because of a civil war within the House of York. Now, whatever happens later with Henry trying to reinvent himself as the heir of Lancaster and completing the union of the warring houses, the fact is, in 1483, Henry is now put forward as a king by Yorkist rebels. His whole rise to the throne is built by Yorkists who just simply don't like Richard III. But he would never have become king in any way, shape, or form. There was never any talk of him becoming king until Richard III rises to the throne. So I think we can get rid of all these ideas that Margaret Beaufort had lifelong ambitions for his son, or Henry himself had lifelong ambitions. He simply was a penniless Welsh exile, languishing abroad, in kind of purgatory, really, until Richard acts a fool and takes the crown and transforms Henry Tudor's life.
Well, and that's so interesting to think about, because it seemed like he had no chance. And then suddenly, after all these years really languishing, as you say, so how is it that Henry, because although it happens through these Yorkists who were dissatisfied with Richard, how is Henry able to believe in himself enough as a potential heir to take that seriously and to take it on and to cross the channel and come back and really invade and take the throne? I mean, how does he get that sense of self?
It's obviously impossible to know for certain, because at the end of the day, we don't have their diaries and so on. But I think there's two things. I think there's two things at play here. I think, first of all, Henry's got no choice. I mean, people have come to him and said, be our king. He's looked around. He's 28 years old. He's got no wife. He's got no children. He's got nothing going for him. It's a matter of time before he gets betrayed. He's going to be betrayed at some point by the Bretons. He's going to be handed over and he's going to be killed. I think he just decides, you know what, let's just go for it. Let's just go. You know, I've got nothing else to go for. I'll raise an army. I'll go across to England, try and fight the king, probably die in battle, but what else is there? But on the flip side of that, Henry may have believed in some concept that he was a chosen one, that he was one who's destined to be king. We definitely see that in the propaganda in the run-up to Bosworth that he sends, and we definitely know after Bosworth he really goes to town and how it is manifest destiny, God's judgment himself that he was to be king, very famously captured by Shakespeare, of course, 100 years later. So I think it's difficult to know. It could be both of these. It could be that Henry realised he had no choice. He had nothing going for him, so he decided to be all in. And then he used ideas of historical propaganda and things such as that to convince himself, to build the confidence that he was the chosen one. Look at boxers today. Every boxer steps into a ring determined they are going to win. You cannot step into a ring as a boxer with any inch of doubt that you might get hurt. You can't do that as a fighter. We can argue perhaps Henry got himself into a mindset that he could win because he had to win. There was no other option. Death was the other option.
So you see him, and I'm just really interesting. You see him as early as December 1483, beginning to sign his letters, Henry R. And that shows a shift that he makes the commitment to publicly to marry Elizabeth of York, to follow through on this plan. And then he's in, I think, from that point. I mean, he's spoken it publicly, he's signing his letters that way. When you call this son of prophecy, and you've alluded to sort of some ancient legends and prophecies, take us through that. So Henry had something in his past to fall back on to sort of propel that story as he's creating a new narrative.
Yes, so the son of prophecy is an ancient and wonderful bardic tradition in Wales that was carried on throughout the medieval period, where many poets were well versed in prophetic poetry. And basically, a central element of these poems were the son of prophecy, a messianic figure who would return to deliver the Welsh people from servitude. And the roots go back to as far as the 9th century, really, and this poetry was always sent through Wales during 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, and it promised a redeemer would come back. And this redeemer would basically rescue the whole island of Britain once more for the British/Welsh people. And they had been scattered, throughout the kingdom by the invading Saxons. They'd been pushed to the corners, what we could still see today being Wales and Cornwall. Now, in these poems, they said that the British hero would come back and he would push all the Saxons and all the foreigners into the sea. The Thames would run red with blood, and one of their own would be crowned a king in London. And this is what the son of prophecy, the poetry, was going on for centuries in Wales. Now, it was a potent tradition and a powerful piece of political propaganda. And there were numerous Welsh leaders who the term son of prophecy was attributed to. There was Llywelyn the Last, who, as the name suggests, was the last Welsh prince, but he got killed. There was Owain Lawgoch, a Welshman who was living in France, who claimed to be the true Prince of Wales until an English assassin took him out before he could cause any more trouble. And then there was Owain Glyndwr, a relation of Henry Tudor, who led what is still the last Welsh War of Independence, which was the war in 1400 that the Welsh Tudors took part in. He is still in Wales today, considered to be the last native Welshman to hold the title Prince of Wales, but he failed. So many men were lauded with this title. Now, as the 15th century wears on, the bards suddenly become aware, oh, Henry Tudor, he's got quite a bit of Welsh blood in him, born in Wales. We all know his family background, and they start to, they start to provoke some poetry in support of Henry Tudor. They call him things like a high-born Briton, the hope of our race. They can't wait for him to show with his double-edged sword. He's going to come down from the mountains. They repeatedly bang on that this boy is the hope of the Welsh, the son of prophecy, the foretold one. And of course, Henry might have used this to garner some of his own. I'm the son of prophecy. I can do this. Build up his own confidence. And it's certainly important that one of the first things he does when he lands in Wales is he raises a red dragon. And the red dragon is connected to this poetry because the last king of the Britons was a 6th century king called Cadwallader. And Cadwallader is somebody that Henry claims as an ancestor. He also claims someone called King Arthur.
Yeah.
So Henry's aware of all of this mythology, and he uses it to power himself. He uses it to build support, and it works. Henry is crowned in London, The Thames does not run red with blood, of course, and the Saxons or the English were not scattered. But it's very interesting that after Henry is crowned king in London, one of the Welsh bards boasts that there is now a golden crown on our kinsman. And the bards, for the first time in 400 years, fall silent. The son of prophecy is here. He has finally revealed himself. Now, shortly afterwards, we get people like Polydor Virgil and Bernard Andre, court historians of Henry VII's court, who started to talk him up as being a prophesied one. Most famously, William Shakespeare would go on 100 years later to write in one of his plays how Henry VI had foretold remarkably that this young small boy, his nephew, had, I think, a face framed for a crown. You know, that the story went in English circles down to this day that Henry VI had prophesied that. That's all taken from the actual story, which is the Welsh bards were prophesying that Henry was the Messiah. And there we go. That's where the whole son of prophecy essentially comes from. I mean, it's quite interesting. When Henry goes to Worcester in the first year of his reign, he's king, he goes to Worcester and he's met with a massive pageant. And part of that pageant features a red dragon approach him and claim that he is the fulfiller of the prophecy. You know, it was a very potent piece of political propaganda, both before he became king, and he definitely used it once he was king.
Well, and you can see the odds were so against him when he comes back, prophecy or not, and meets Richard III, this, brilliant military strategist, and is able to defeat the king's army. I mean, it's just quite extraordinary. You can see why people would say that must have been a prophecy, because this shouldn't have happened. So
exactly, and you can see why they consider it God's divine judgment. God has ruled on this day. Henry shouldn't have won. Numbers, experience, there's no reason he should have won the Battle of Bosworth, but he did.
Yeah, so this brings him to the throne. He begins this dynasty that really changes everything. How loyal was he? And I'm asking this because I know you like to talk about it. How loyal was he to his Welsh roots as king of, often England is first in that, consideration. You're king of England and some other places. How loyal was he to Wales?
Well, this is it. I mean, the problem that Henry VII has is that during his day, he clearly couldn't live up to the expectations the Welsh bards had for him, which is to make the Thames run red with blood.
Yeah.
In the modern day, to many Welsh people, he turned his back on Wales once he became king and did nothing for the Welsh, because the Welsh are still not an independent people. Now, the truth is, when you look down, when you dig deep into Henry and his background, we can see clear evidence that he thought a lot of the Welsh and he thought a lot of himself as a Welshman. The number one thing he does is he names his firstborn son Arthur. No other king of England is naming their principal heir Arthur during these days. He uses a red dragon as his principal badge. He actually merges the red dragon of Cadwallader, his ancestor, with the green and white colours of the Tudor family. And he creates the modern Welsh flag, which is still in existence today. He always retained close links with his Welsh family members who were still living. Jasper Tudor is one of them. He had a half uncle called David Owen. David Owen was remarkably close to Henry during the rest of the reign. He rewards Welshmen unlike any other king of England before. Many of them now hold, for the first time, real power. The reason that a lot of his ancestors used to rebel was because Welshmen were not given offices under English rule. Henry changes on that. He now makes men like Rhys ap Thomas and William Griffith chamberlains. I think there was even the Bishop of St. David's was a Welshman for the first time in 200 years. So offices are suddenly opened up to the Welsh, widespread. Henry makes payments every year to the Welshmen in a service to celebrate St. David's Day, our national patron saint. No other King of England has done that up to that point. That shows Henry is in tune with his Welsh background. He understands the importance of St. David's Day to the Welsh. We also have access to Henry's private payments. And when you look into this, you see many payments for all the things that brought him joy, because, surprise, surprise, he was not a miser, but he was a very big spender. But some of the payments we do see, I find interesting. He regularly buys Welsh cheese, and he regularly buys Welsh mead. And I think that these are perhaps tastes that he remembers from his childhood. I live in England today. I always try and buy Welsh cakes when I can. You know, the exile away from homeland develops almost an OTT hankering for things from their background. I mean, we've got a lot of American candy now in British superstores, especially in the big cities. There clearly is a market over here for Americans buying things from their homeland. And Henry was the same, but he was our king. He could do what he wanted to do. So he was sending people into Wales to bring to him things I imagine he liked as a child. Now, no, he did not grant Wales its independence, and of course that's would have been an absurd realization anyway, because he had just invaded England through Wales. He's not suddenly going to give it away to somebody else. You know, from a matter of security, that would be absurd. But he does pave the way for his son, or actually more properly Thomas Cromwell, to eventually bring about the Acts of Union in 1536. And this is when Wales was created for the first time as a formal nation, but then annexed into the Crown of England.
Yeah.
And we remain a part of the Crown of England to this very day. And it is controversial, but to the Welsh people living during that day, they championed this, because for the first time, it raised Welsh to an equal standing with the English, even in their own country. The Welsh were not made greater than the English. They were simply brought up to the same level, which is all they were asking for. Equality. For too long, there had been this racial ceiling in Wales for the Welsh, and that was now swept away. And that could not have been done, really, without Henry VII coming to the throne and almost revolutionising how Welsh people were viewed under English rule. I think it's very telling. During the whole Tudor century, the only part of the kingdom that did not lead a full-scale rebellion against any of the Tudor monarchs was Wales. The Welsh people were satisfied. They had their kinsman on the crown, whether that was Henry VIII, who clearly didn't care a bit about Wales, because he didn't care about anyone but himself. Elizabeth I, etc. The Welsh were happy with the Tudors. And when the Stuarts come onto the throne, we see something similar happen, but this time it's for the Scots, who come down and take up the great offices. And you can argue the Welsh were pushed, perhaps to this day, back into the corner.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that's great, and it's a great way to see him as a Welshman on the throne and what he did do. So I really appreciate that, because I think we sometimes lose that.
And he was recognised as a Welshman by other people as well. Richard III himself remarks that he was a Welshman during the propaganda war that was taking place before Bosworth. And in 1500, a Venetian ambassador is visiting London, and he says the Welsh have recovered their former independence because the most wise and fortunate Henry VII is a Welshman. Like, people were remarking on it. It was known, and it would only have been known if he was also making people aware.
Right.
I am a Welshman. I also happen to be King of England.
Yeah, he's owning it and sharing it, and you can see that others are getting that. Well, that's great. So we now have, he's on the throne. He establishes this dynasty. He's doing what he can for the Welsh. What kind of change, just sort of overall, does it make in English, Welsh, British history that this family and this man from this family, you see this arc with Owen, well, you see this arc from young Henry, who ends up on the throne starting this dynasty? What kind of change does that make? Because it seems to me it's a pretty significant one historically.
I think historically what it does is it brings an end to this cycle of violence that was always taking place for 500-600 years between the Welsh and Saxon/Norman/English. It ends that cycle of violence. Those days are done. Again, in the modern day, a lot of people can trace back both positive and negative aspects of the current status of Wales to the Tudors. And that, of course, depends on one's political vantage point. I would say, as always, when it comes to people in the modern age trying to use history for political reasons, I think everybody's kind of way off the mark. But it definitely has altered and continues to alter Wales's relationship with the Union, with the United Kingdom. In a way that's quite more complex than Scotland and England. There is obviously a modern Scottish movement to succeed from the Union, but Scotland and England entered the United Kingdom in 1707 as equal partners. Wales was not an equal partner because it had already been annexed into the Kingdom of England. But again, at the time for those people, peace reigned for the Welsh. If the Tudors hadn't come to the fore and Wales continued to suffer under the boot of English oppression, which is exactly what was the case in the 15th century, where would we be today? It's a very interesting what-if question, because peace would not have been brought as it ultimately was through the reign of the Tudors. I don't know, I've never thought about it. Interesting.
Well, it is interesting to see the long-term effects of this family and of this man as the leader in some ways, or the most well-known to us, but who starts this whole dynasty and really changes things. And that is what we can learn about in this marvelous book. Do you have a copy to hold up? Because I don't have my copy yet.
I don't, not yet, I'm afraid.
Okay.
They're on their way.
I'll share some. Certainly. We're just getting so close to publication day, and then it takes a while. But thank you, Nathen. This has been absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate it. Now I have to ask you, what are you working on next? Because I heard you make this very disturbing comment that this might be your last book, and I certainly hope that's not the case.
I am currently basking in my retirement.
Okay.
For the first time in 10 years, I'm not writing. I have nothing left on my mind at the moment. Like this was a story I always wanted to tell, and I've got it out. So I'm taking a rest. Never say never. I'm sure something's going to come to mind. As you know, when it comes to writing books, it's about the right subject in the right market as well. Because, you know, at the end of the day, you can't write a book if someone else has recently written the same book and so on. So I'm sure something will present itself in the future. But for now, I'm retired.
Well, all right. Well, I'll certainly keep bugging you to do something else. Thank you. And I will certainly put all of your information, but let us know where we can follow on social media and all that. And I'll put it in the show notes as well. But where can we find you?
Yeah, just simply type my name into either Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and you'll come across me, Nathen Amin. And increasingly, I'm trying to drive my following to my Substack, which is where I'm starting to write more longer length posts and articles. So join my Substack if you're going to join anything. It's free, and you get all my articles directly into your inbox.
Yes, you do, because I do, and I have them, and they're great. And that's why I know, as much as you're writing, I really believe there's another book in there. So I'm not giving up on you. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nathen. And again, everyone, Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor, available soon. And for those of us in the US, it's a little bit later date, but I will include some places you can get it without waiting until it's released in the US, if, like me, you simply cannot wait. Really appreciate you, Nathen, coming on. And as always, it's been such a treat to talk to you.
No problems. Thank you very much.
All right. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Could I please ask a favor? Would you mind leaving a rating, maybe making a comment, subscribing, checking us out on YouTube, subscribing there? We really appreciate your support, and you are the reason we keep doing these episodes and the thing that keeps us going. Thank you so much for coming to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics.